The convoy waited on the edge of the road just after sunrise, its trucks lined in a rough row, with engines already running and thin smoke rising into the cold air. And the sound of motors filled the space where voices had gone quiet, as people stood holding papers and small bundles, knowing that once the trucks moved, there would be no turning back. The woman stood a few steps away from the line, not close enough to be counted, and not far enough to leave, her boots planted in the frozen dirt as if she might still be pulled forward if she stayed still long enough. She had been awake since before light, walking from the edge of town after hearing that a convoy would pass through, and now she watched names being called while soldiers checked lists against worn documents. Each time a name was spoken, someone stepped forward and climbed onto a truck, helped by a hand or a quick nod, and the space beside her grew emptier as the road cleared. She kept her papers folded tight in both hands, careful not to drop them, because she had been told that without them she would not even be allowed to stand there. Her coat was too thin for the season, and she could feel the cold through the cloth, but she did not move or complain, knowing that attention could work against her as easily as it could help. One truck after another was sealed, canvas pulled down and tied, while the officer at the front of the line checked his watch and spoke quietly to the men beside him. The woman shifted her weight once, then stopped, afraid that any movement might mark her as impatient or unfit, and she looked instead at the back of the nearest truck, counting the scratches in the wood to steady herself. Somewhere behind her, someone whispered that the convoy was already full, and the sound made her chest tighten, even though no one had spoken to her directly. She had been denied places before, turned away from doors and told to wait for help that never came, and the feeling returned now, heavy and familiar, as the last few civilians were waved forward. A soldier glanced at her once, and then looked away, already thinking of the road ahead, and the engines grew louder, as if the trucks were eager to leave. The woman stood alone beside the convoy, not crying and not calling out, only waiting, while the space for her narrowed with every passing second, and the morning slipped away. The checkpoint had been set up to control movement before curfew, and everyone passing through understood that once the lamps were extinguished, the road would close until morning, leaving anyone outside without shelter or direction. The woman had arrived hours earlier, following signs posted at the edge of town that promised access if papers were in order, and she had waited patiently as carts, bicycles, and small trucks moved ahead of her. The guards worked from a stack of instructions pinned to the table, checking names and stamps against the latest orders, and the process was meant to be consistent, even though conditions changed daily. She watched each person step forward, present documents, and receive a brief nod or stamp before being allowed to continue, and she noted that most interactions lasted only seconds. When it had been her turn, she had approached with care, placing her papers flat as instructed and standing back so the clerk could work without obstruction. The refusal came quickly and without explanation, leaving her unsure whether the problem was a missing stamp, an outdated form, or something else entirely. Now, standing to the side, she could see the table clearly, but she was no longer part of the line, and that separation carried its own meaning. The evening air cooled rapidly, and the smell of oil from the lamps mixed with dust from the road as traffic continued. She did not know where she was expected to go next, because the town behind her was already under curfew rules, and returning there would only bring more questions. The instructions posted at the checkpoint offered no guidance for those turned aside, only rules for passage, and she realized that waiting might be her only option. A guard glanced at her once and then looked away, already focused on the next set of papers, and she understood that without intervention, she would remain unseen. She adjusted her grip on the documents and stood straight, not wanting to draw attention through discomfort or fatigue, even as the hours of waiting weighed on her. The lamps were lit higher as dusk deepened, signaling that the window for crossing was closing, and the woman remained still at the edge of the checkpoint, caught between the barrier and the night, holding papers that no longer moved her forward. The clerk continued his work as if the refusal had closed the matter, and the woman felt the quiet shift that came when a decision was treated as complete without being explained. Another civilian stepped forward. Papers were checked, a stamp was placed, and the barrier lifted again, and each smooth movement made her position at the side feel more fixed. She held her documents at waist level now, no longer offering them, because she had been told they were not acceptable, and there was no instruction to try again. A guard told her to stand farther back so she would not block the flow, and she complied at once, moving closer to the edge of the road where the ground sloped slightly downward. From there, she could see the checkpoint clearly, but she was no longer part of it, and the distance marked her as finished business. The hardship was not spoken aloud, but it was clear in the way others avoided her gaze, careful not to draw attention to their own passage by acknowledging her delay. She watched the lamps flicker as the wind shifted, and she noticed the guards beginning to hurry, their movements sharper as time pressed against the rules they were meant to enforce. No one explained how she could correct the problem with her papers, and no option was offered beyond waiting, even though waiting would soon be useless once curfew began. She considered asking a question, but the tone of the refusal had made it clear that discussion was not expected, and she chose not to risk further rejection. The denial was procedural rather than cruel, delivered as part of an efficient system that did not pause for individual difficulty, and that made it harder to respond to. A cart passed through the barrier and disappeared down the road, and she felt the sense of being left behind deepen with each passing moment. The cold reached her hands and shoulders now that she was no longer moving, and she shifted her weight once before stilling herself again, determined not to appear restless or uncooperative. The guards spoke among themselves about the remaining daylight, and the woman understood that once the final count was made, there would be no space for reconsideration. She stood quietly with her papers, aware that the denial had placed her outside protection for the night, not because she lacked need or effort, but because the process had moved past her without room to turn back. As the line thinned and the road grew quieter, the reason for her refusal began to change shape through small comments rather than clear rules, and the woman sensed it without being told directly. A guard near the barrier said her papers looked old, and another replied that older documents caused trouble later, even if they were once valid. The words were spoken as general observations, but they settled around her position and explained her presence at the side, without requiring anyone to look at her again. Someone suggested that civilians without the latest stamp should be held back to avoid mistakes, and the idea was accepted without anyone checking whether it applied to her case. She remained still, understanding that defending herself would only draw more attention to a label already forming, and she chose silence instead. But the rumor did not accuse her of wrongdoing, but it placed her in a category that made delay acceptable and assistance unnecessary. A clerk passed by with another stack of forms and did not pause, assuming the matter had been handled, and the woman felt herself pushed further outside the process without any new instruction. She took a small step back when told to clear the area, moving closer to a wooden post that marked the edge of the checkpoint, and she kept her eyes lowered to avoid appearing confrontational. The mislabel worked quickly, turning uncertainty into justification, and soon no one questioned why she was no longer being considered. The guards returned their focus to the remaining traffic, and conversation shifted back to timing and counts, leaving her out of the exchange entirely. She stood with her papers folded now, no longer expecting them to be reviewed, and she waited only because the road ahead was closed and the town behind her offered no answer. The exclusion settled without announcement, complete and efficient, and she accepted the position because resisting it seemed impossible within the rules being enforced. As the lamps burned brighter against the darkening sky, she prepared herself for the night outside the barrier, carrying the weight of a decision that had been made about her without her voice being part of it. The American captain had been standing a short distance from the table, watching the flow of traffic rather than the details of each check, because his role was to keep the checkpoint moving before curfew closed the road. He noticed the woman, not because she spoke or stepped forward, but because she did not move at all, remaining in the same place while the line thinned and the light faded. Experience had taught him that when someone stayed still for too long at a checkpoint, it was usually not by choice, and he took a moment to observe before intervening. He saw that her papers were folded carefully and held close, not abandoned or pushed away in frustration, and that no mark had been made to indicate her case was resolved. The captain watched another civilian pass through with a brief check and a stamp. Then, looked back at the woman and saw that no one had returned to her since the initial refusal. He stepped closer to the table and asked the clerk how many people remained to be processed, and the clerk replied with a number that did not include her. That detail caught his attention, because he could see her plainly and knew that uncounted people created problems later. He asked why she was standing aside, and the answer he received was uncertain, based on assumptions rather than regulation, and that uncertainty mattered more to him than the refusal itself. The captain walked toward her without haste, stopping at a respectful distance, and asked to see her documents in a calm, even tone. She handed them over without comment, her expression unchanged, and he took the time to read them fully, rather than glance at the top page. As he compared the dates and stamps to the orders posted at the table, he saw that her papers met the requirements that had been enforced all afternoon. There was no error that justified her exclusion, only hesitation that had hardened into refusal because time was short. The captain looked back toward the barrier and then at the road ahead, understanding that correcting the situation now would prevent a larger issue later. He returned the papers to her and told her to wait where she was, using clear words that carried authority without impatience. The act of attention alone shifted the space around her, marking her case as open again, and the checkpoint paused just enough for the captain to decide how to proceed within his responsibility. The captain returned to the table with her papers in hand and laid them flat beside the posted orders, aligning each page carefully so there would be no confusion about what he was referencing. He did not raise his voice or question the clerk's intent, but he pointed to the relevant section of the instructions and then to the dates and stamps on her documents, making the comparison clear without argument. The clerk leaned closer, reading again what he had dismissed earlier, and the pause drew quiet attention from the nearby guards, who sensed a correction rather than a confrontation. The captain explained, in short and simple terms, that the papers were valid under the current movement order, and that the refusal had been based on caution rather than rule. He stated that delays caused by uncertainty were understandable, but that leaving a civilian outside the checkpoint without cause created a larger risk once curfew began. The words were practical, focused on responsibility rather than blame, and they framed the solution as a matter of order. He took a pen from the table and signed the document himself, adding his rank and the date in clear writing, then pressed the official stamp beside his signature to complete the authorization. The action was decisive but calm, done in full view, so there would be no confusion later about who had approved the passage. He handed the papers back to the clerk and instructed him to record the crossing as normal, then turned to the woman and told her she would proceed through the barrier at once. She accepted the papers with steady hands, not speaking, and waited for the signal to move. The barrier was lifted, and the space that had held her apart opened without ceremony, restoring her path forward through the same procedure that had stopped her. The captain stepped back to his position, satisfied that the correction had been made cleanly and within his authority, and the checkpoint resumed its rhythm as if the pause had always been part of the process. When the barrier lifted, the woman stepped forward at a measured pace, not rushing and not hesitating, following the same path others had taken minutes earlier. A guard gestured for her to proceed down the marked lane, and she did so without looking back, holding her papers close as she passed the table where they were stamped and recorded. The movement felt simple, but the simplicity carried weight, because it replaced uncertainty with direction. She crossed the checkpoint line and entered the controlled side of the road, where traffic flowed away from the town and toward designated shelter before nightfall. The guards returned to their positions, and the captain watched briefly to ensure the process continued smoothly, then turned his attention back to the remaining vehicles. No one spoke to her as she moved on, and no explanation was given to those waiting behind her, because the correction had already been made and required no announcement. She followed the signs posted along the road, joining a small group being directed toward a temporary holding area, where names would be checked again and space assigned. The air felt different beyond the barrier, less exposed, and the road ahead was clearly marked, removing the uncertainty that had held her in place earlier. She adjusted her coat and continued walking, her steps steady now that she knew where she was meant to go. The checkpoint faded behind her, its lamps and barriers becoming smaller as distance replaced attention. The transfer did not involve vehicles or escorts, only permission to move within the rules that govern the area, and that permission was enough to carry her forward. As she reached the next signpost, she slowed briefly to read the instructions, then followed them without question, trusting the order that had finally included her. The road led toward shelter and oversight rather than isolation, and the simple act of crossing the checkpoint placed her back within protection for the night. Once she had crossed fully beyond the checkpoint, the attention that had followed her refusal fell away, and she became part of the general movement, rather than an exception under review. At the holding area ahead, another clerk checked her papers briefly, noted the captain's signature, and marked her passage without comment, treating the authorization as settled fact, rather than something unusual. The quiet efficiency of the exchange confirmed that her position was no longer in doubt, and the uncertainty that had weighed on her since the first refusal began to lift. She was directed to stand with others waiting for shelter assignment, and she took her place without drawing notice, no longer separated from the group. The guards moved past her without pause, focused on timing and order, then and their lack of reaction signaled acceptance more clearly than words could. She folded her papers carefully and placed them inside her coat, knowing they would not be needed again that evening, and she straightened her posture as she waited. The rumor that had formed around her at the barrier did not follow her here, replaced by the simple record of her clearance and presence. Around her, civilians stood quietly, sharing the same tired patience, and the sameness of the moment restored a sense of balance that had been missing before. No one asked why she had been delayed, and no explanation was offered, because the process had already absorbed her without resistance. The captain passed through the area once more, checking movement times, and when his eyes met hers briefly, he gave no sign of recognition beyond the acknowledgement given to everyone present. That small neutrality mattered, because it confirmed that she had not been singled out for favor, only corrected through duty. As the group was guided onward toward shelter, she followed with calm steps, aware that dignity had returned not through attention or sympathy, but through the restoration of order that allowed her to move forward like anyone else. The shelter assigned for the night was a converted public building with lights kept low and doors monitored according to curfew rules, and the woman entered with the others without ceremony. Inside, space was limited but organized, and she was shown where to sit, and later, where to rest, receiving the same instructions given to everyone present. She settled into the assigned area quietly, placing her coat beneath her head and her papers beside her, aware that the night would pass under supervision rather than uncertainty. The sounds of the checkpoint did not follow her here, replaced by the subdued movement of people arranging themselves for rest and the steady presence of guards at the entrance. No one spoke about the refusal that had nearly kept her outside, because the system had already moved past that moment, and there was no need to revisit it. The war continued beyond the walls, with orders still being issued and roads still controlled. But inside the shelter, the focus was on maintaining calm and safety until morning. She lay still, fully clothed, listening to the quiet around her, and felt the weight of the day settle without fear. There was no sense of triumph in the room, only relief carried without display, and that tone suited her well. She closed her eyes, knowing that she had not been forced to plead or explain, and that her dignity had been restored through responsibility rather than spectacle. When sleep came, it did so naturally, and she rested inside for the night while the larger movements of the war continued elsewhere, unchanged and unacknowledged.